All right, then. Looks like we're just about ready to start. So first off, thanks to everyone for attending this presentation. I do need to remind everyone that the presentation will be recorded as well as the Q&A session at the end. So if you don't want to be recorded, then you'll have to either stay quiet or hopefully be okay with being recorded. Right, then it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alta Grobbelaar, and thank you so much for speaking to us. I'd like to start with just a little bit of background as to why I was particularly excited to invite her to our departmental seminar. Now, I've attended several of the seminars presented in the Department of Political Studies because they are endlessly fascinating. And Dr. Grobbelaar's presentation showed, in my view, not only a high level of lucid, sophisticated thinking, but also a high degree of methodological congruence between the way that she uses critical discourse analysis and some of the research that has been conducted in our Department of English. And so it seemed to me that many of us would benefit from hearing more about what she is up to. She's a lecturer and a researcher in the Department of Political Studies and Governance at the UFS, and her research focuses on terrorism and its various manifestations across Africa. Her conviction is that research can only be useful if scholars learn to be as adaptable as the phenomena they study. And that approach is particularly vital given the pace at which terrorism, cyber terrorism, and the discourses surrounding terrorism in Africa evolve. In July this year, she'll be presenting a paper on international security discourses on cyber terrorism in Africa at the International Political Science Association World Conference in Argentina. So, without further ado, I happily hand over to Dr. Alta Grobbelaar.
Thank you so much, Dinas, for that wonderful introduction. And I'd also like to thank the Department of English for this wonderful opportunity to share my research, my past research and my ongoing research with some scholars that are sometimes not in the field of politics. And I'm very happy to hear that someone out of politics find it interesting and that can learn from it as well. I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you. Can I just get confirmation that you can see the PowerPoint? All right, perfect. Okay, so the topic today that I am covering is help or hindrance using critical discourse analysis to understand terrorism in Africa. I think terrorism in Africa is something that we will probably never fully understand. So I think the more methods that we have to probably help us understand, the better we might get to probably ameliorating the threat, because I think we've landed somewhere where we know we can never completely solve the threat of terrorism. Now, if we look at discourse theory and discourse analysis, I want to start with discourse theory, which is, as Dahlberg states, in its simplest form, a theory of politics, the hegemonic formation of social relations, of discourses that involve hierarchies of power and relations of inclusion and exclusion. If we look at critical discourse analysis, forward in this conversation, I will refer to it as CDA. It's an approach to the study of discourse that sees language as a form of social interaction. CDA combines critique of discourses and seeks to explain how it influences existing social realities. These realities in turn serve as a basis for possible action that could influence, change, or even overthrow said social contexts or interactions. When working with the lens of CDA, researchers often aim to look at more than language and incorporate social practice to linguistic practice as well, and how these interact and influence one another. This interaction can challenge, influence, establish, and reinforce societal power relations. CDA would differ from discourse analysis in the sense that it highlights issues of power relations, manipulation, social justice, and societal inequalities found in places where discourses are established and disseminated, like the media, education, and of course, politics. A prominent theme in discourse analysis is that specific discourses replace and alter assumptions that are universally accepted by society. These altered assumptions are then strengthened by those with access to the media and a broad audience, like journalists, celebrities, politicians, and in this case, terrorist organizations. This constant change in discourse points to the applicability of this type of research. Not only does the threat of terrorism change and evolve daily, so do the individual group's relation to the media, government, and other discourses. CDA investigates the role of discourse in strengthening these unequal power relations and exposes how some groups and individuals are influenced, marginalized, or even exploited by those who have what we will call the discourse privilege. I will expand a bit more on the concept of discourse privilege and discursive power relations later. While some discourses focus on and provide guidance on certain courses of action, those same discourses draw large numbers of support, while others are labeled as stupid, immoral, or illegitimate. Thus, the general public and policymakers are in a way prescribed how they should react to certain events or crises. One of the functions of discourse analysis, and indeed my research, is to expose the foundation of these altered assumptions and to reveal how they relate to differing interests within the international community. Using CDA as a theoretical base in a study of international relations or political science aims to not only deconstruct the hegemonic formation of social relations within terrorist groups itself, but also to understand the power relations between terrorist groups and those who are influenced by these organizations. Now, immediately I would stop myself there and ask, who would not be influenced by these organizations? We need to demarcate, and let's do that. Let's make this analysis, be it critical or not, a bit more digestible. The first issue to highlight or demarcate in the study would be terrorist organizations. Let's be realistic. The term terrorism itself is a heavily contested term. An entire thesis could be and should be and will be written on the dangers of under or over defining a super influential term like terrorism. Ample research has been done on terrorism, what it is, how it manifests, how it's born, grown, fed, honed, etc. But what this research aims to do is to study how we, as researchers, talk about terrorism, how violent extremists themselves talk about their own actions, how those who try to counter the effects of terrorism communicate about it, and how all of this talking and communication help or hinder us in understanding this phenomenon in a certain geographic region. Which brings me to my next demarcation, geography. Africa. Researchers in Africa, many of us in this presentation, myself included, are usually immediately irritated when someone dares to mention Africa as a conceptual whole. Africa is not a single country. Africa cannot be studied as a single entity. These are phrases that come to mind, maybe phrases that I've heard at discussions or conferences, or phrases that I myself have used in some of my haughtier moments. We all have them. It's okay. For this study, I specifically looked at Boko Haram and Shabaab and the regions in which they are most active. So please bear with me when I say things like terrorists in Africa, two very contested terms, or terrorism in Africa. The demarcation stand, so don't hold me over the coals later on. All right. I'd like to cover what has been done in terms of research and political discourse. Academic scholarship in terrorism studies have indeed been expanding. For example, Since the attacks of September 11, 2001, there's been a growing body of research published on terrorism from a variety of critical perspectives. Some scholars have drawn attention to other examples of September 11. The term September 11, more commonly known as 9/11, has become a phrase used in many different contexts. This could be noted after the 2008 bombings in Mumbai, when media reports in India claimed that it was India's 9/11. People also dubbed the attacks in Paris in November 2015 as France's own 9/11. In discussing the name-making of 9/11 in official accounts, Robert Jackson highlights 4 key features. The attacks and the day itself were discursively constructed as an incomparable tragedy. The discourses used immediately labeled the attacks as an act of war rather than a criminal act or mass murder. Similarities were drawn to other attacks and threats against the US, like Pearl Harbor and a threat against civilization. And lastly, the way in which the event was reported immediately removed the possibility of creating other possible meanings and assumptions. The significance of these key features rests in the fact that while attacks by Boko Haram and Shabaab may be of similar scale and intensity, it will not lead to these extreme discourses. Language and how it is used or not used is key in understanding identities and interests inherent in discourses. Foucault writes that the task of analyzing discourses is not reducible to language. However, it could be argued that analysis of practices includes language that is actively in use or language as it is used during particular social interactions. Scholars and critics alike have long accepted and recognized the ability of political discourse to steer and shape ideas and understanding of the future. Aristotle designated the future as the temporal domain of deliberative rhetoric. He believed that deliberative rhetoric focuses on possible actions in the future that we have in our power to get going, and with that, deliberate rhetoric aims to establish the feasibility or harmfulness of a possible course of action. This is where the hope for the future relevance and usage of this research is also highlighted. Edelman contends that political discourse can also be characterized by epistemic modality, as it tries to predict or foresee what will be at some future moment. He sees this as a rhetorical act through which those with the discursive power, whether it be political actors, journalists, or terrorists, make rhetorical evocations of a remote time unlikely to arrive. These elicitations then have more concrete effects by justifying physical acts of proposal or policies in which the one power's ideas or goals are manifested. This tactic is used by governmental institutions whenever they have the discursive power. These institutions are in most cases positioned to assume and advocate prediction of the future to the public because only government can evoke fairly confident expectations of future welfare or deprivation and create the perceived worlds that in turn shape perceptions and interpretations of current events and therefore the behavior with which people respond to them. Edelman's governmental institutions can also be applied to religious and military leaders within the ranks of Boko Haram and Shabaab. My research do not focus on the position of various states' governments, so Edelman's ideas was not used in its purest form. Instead, it served as a valuable tool to study and analyze leaders and members of these specific terrorist organizations, assuming that within their geographic regions in which they are active, their actions and discourses Their positions within social context would give them the discursive power or the discourse privilege at a certain point in time. Their specific interpretations of Western culture, the active governments in their states, and the application of Sharia are relayed to their members and followers and accepted as truth because of the positions of power that they hold and display. A considerable amount of discourse analysis has been done, largely non-critical. In other words, it does not necessarily question or critique current social practices in various contexts. So Norman Fairclough emphasizes that the survival and the value of CDA would depend on people using it in different ways, and thus pushing the theory and application in new directions. Using different trans and interdisciplinary research as a source of theoretical and methodological development leads to a continuous process of change within the academic field. There are, however, a few general characteristics that can differentiate CDA from other forms of research and analysis. According to Fairclough, research that is to be considered valued CDA research should have a certain set of characteristics. Firstly, it's not only the analysis of discourse itself in terms of text and words, it's part of a systematic interdisciplinary analysis of text, as well as other relations and elements in the social process. Secondly, it's not just commenting on discourse in terms of words used, it includes the systematic analysis of different forms of texts as well. And thirdly, it's not only of a descriptive nature, it can and should include normative elements as well. This then addresses the social cleavages in terms of their discursive values and includes possible ways of changing and mitigating them. These characteristics speaks directly to the applicability of discourse analysis within this field of study. Within my research and the relevant case studies, discourses used by Boko Haram and Shabaab were studied. To add to the value of using CDA specifically, the justifications and ideological motivations used by these groups were analyzed. This not only speaks to their anti-Western ideals, but also their usage of propaganda and specific persuasive or fear-inducing discourses. The ability of terrorism to induce fear and anxiety can be largely attributed to the discourses that arise from the acts of terrorism, not to mention the obvious fear that the act itself induces. By comparing Jackson's minimalist foundationalist redefinition of terrorism with the more comprehensive interpretation of A.P. Smith, attention can clearly be focused on the communication intent of terrorism. Now, Smith's definition, the second one on the screen, reminds us that the victims of terrorism, or rather the direct victims of terrorism, are hardly ever the intentional target. Instead, they are caught in the crossfire to receive maximum attention and to send a message to those that can be described as the intended targets. Schmidt uses a very harsh phrase there that I highlighted, where he calls the targets message generators. The discourses after such an attack may be aimed at either the ruling government of the country in which the attack happened, or the entire culture, values, or the history of a specific country. Looking at Jackson's definition, it would be valuable to note that it acknowledges not only the violent act of terrorism, but also the fear and the intimidation that it induces. This is also where the critical part of this discourse comes into play. As Richard Jackson writes, a central aim of critical discourse analysis lies in revealing the means by which language is deployed to maintain power. Applying that notion of maintaining power to the terrorism phenomenon in Africa, one cannot overlook the politics of fear. The idea that fear is something of political relevance is by no means new, but the way in which it changes according to the particular fear at hand may be new. In this case, the fear is induced across the world by a militant organization, for example, in a fishing village deep in Africa. By using CDA throughout my research, it's mainly utilized to scrutinize actions, frames, and various forms of communications as a form of discourse. This is what separates the study from more orthodox discourse analysis. To use CDA in its fullest extent, it does leave the desire to understand how terrorism challenges what can be described as orthodox or traditional power relations. By using the two case studies at hand, it was established that terrorist organizations have the ability to challenge existing power structures to advance their own goals and insurgencies. The issue of defining terrorism have been discussed. However, by effectively applying CDA, it warrants to mention how terrorism is used as a political tool. This is also not a new concept. It has been researched thoroughly. By combining views and approaches of different academics and researchers in a variety of disciplines, the process of moving away from orthodox discourse and terrorism studies is strengthened. Already in 1984, R.P. Hoffman defined terrorism in terms of a core element, the use of terror for the advancement of objectives. In his thesis, it was proposed that terrorism is a purposeful human political activity directed toward the creation of a general climate of fear and designed to influence in ways desired by the protagonist, other human beings, and through them, some course of events. In the same vein, Marcella argued that all definitions include the idea that terrorism is the use of force or violence by individuals or groups that is directed towards civilian populations and intended to instill fear as a means of coercing individuals or groups to change their political or social positions. And in line with this study and the politics of fear, Bruce Hoffman proposed that terrorism is the deliberate creation and exploitation of fear through violence or only the threat of violence in the pursuit of political change. The definition discussed should sound no different than any state-sanctioned violence or modern warfare. All of the above, in conjunction with CDA describing discourse as an operative word, with various representations of social order and social life, would suggest that the entire concept of terrorism and subsequently the so-called war on terror needs to be reassessed. Although my research does not attempt to do so, yet maybe, the importance of understanding the need for reassessment would help to justify the use of these words and terms like terror, terrorist, terrorist organization throughout a study like this, albeit in some cases quite contested and even sometimes a bit ambiguous. All right, if I get to the case studies. All right, by applying CDA and its mentioned characteristics to the Boko Haram case study, the main focus of the case study was the kidnapping that happened in Shabaab in northern Nigeria in 2014. The hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign made this case study especially interesting through the CDA lens, as the campaign took the world by force and was the world's main focus, not Boko Haram per se, not their intended goals necessarily, not their evolution or their grievances. While studying Boko Haram and their modus operandi throughout their evolution as a violent extremist group, they have employed various tactics as different forms of discourse. Early on, they targeted traditional or village heads, security officials, prominent politicians. Since the mid-2010s, they started to target media houses, journalists, as well as schools. Then came an upsurge in kidnapping, both locals and foreigners. According to their own media spokespeople, the attacks on schools happened in a specific manner for a specific reason. And I posted that up there for you, which is an announcement that they themselves made that says, we attack schools because of immediately justifying how and why they did what they did, because security operatives are going to Islamia schools and picking teachers. We are attacking schools at night because we don't want to kill innocent pupils. The group was thus actively trying to sway the discourse in a certain manner to justify actions and gain an amount of understanding from locals and possible supporters. When kidnapping as a tactic started to really take off for them around 2012, once again, this was framed in a way to justify it in terms of injustices suffered by the group. We would soon start kidnapping the wives and children of all the people that have had hands in the arrest of our wives and children. In March 2014 in Borno, where Shabaab is located, an announcement was made that all secondary schools will be closed due to an increase in school attacks by Boko Haram. Boko Haram claimed that they would continue to attack schools in daylight as long as their brethren were held captive by the Nigerian state. Once again stating that these attacks are forms of retaliation due to the injustices done to them by the Nigerian state. Thinking back on the highlights that we might remember from the Shabaab kidnapping, headlines and the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign, one might assume that things happened quite fast. The school was attacked on the night of the 14th, 15th April. The girls were kidnapped. The hashtag was created. It trended. Abu Bakr Shekau, the then leader of Boko Haram, released the now famous machine gun slinging video where he stated he would sell the girls off into Islamic marriages. However, that is not quite what happened, which provides us with an opportunity to analyze how the discourses was misconstrued and miscommunicated across Nigeria, Africa, and eventually worldwide. Though the parents of the girls claimed that more than 250 girls were missing, Nigeria's military stated on the 19th of April that most of the girls managed to escape or were freed and that only 8 girls were still missing. This might be due to the geographical distance from the event being too great for any significant government structures to accurately record events, or it can be viewed in the light of the Nigerian government's willingness to acknowledge a flaw on their part regarding the protection of their own citizens. The subsequent confusion and lack of definitive military action prompted Nigerians to take to social media. And Ibrahim Abdullahi, a lawyer in Abuja, sent the first tweet using the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls. A video released in May in 2014, Boko Haram claims that the kidnapping was in response to similar tactics deployed by the Nigerian government towards the families of Boko Haram members. Shekau appeared in the video, claiming the attacks and elaborating on Boko Haram's plans with the abducted girls. I abducted your girls, I will sell them, there is a market for them, Allah says I should sell. No one can argue with something like that. Initially, it seemed as though the kidnapping was but a blip on the world's radar. Part of the reason could be because of the confusion surrounding the event. The lack of a clear statement of what had happened led to the existence of a discourse vacuum, and that was later filled by a bunch of conspiracies. After the kidnapping and Boko Haram's first video message threatening to sell the girls as slaves, the international media took notice. This was roughly 3 weeks after the kidnapping. On 12 May 2014, Boko Haram released a second video showing Shekau and about 50 of the kidnapped girls, not the 8. that the Nigerian government claimed was still missing. In this video, Shekau responded to the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls campaign. You keep making a noise about Chibok. We should enslave them. In this video, Shekau repeats the call to release imprisoned Boko Haram members, trying to draw focus back to the intended message of the kidnapping. The timing of this video suggests that it was in response to the international outcry and the hashtag campaign. This strengthened by showing the girls in the video wearing niqabs and letting them state their names and that they have converted to Islam. Shekau again refers to the international media by stating, these girls that you occupy yourselves with, we have indeed liberated them because they have become Muslims. By the time this video was released, it was unclear whether Boko Haram was actually negotiating for the release or exchange of prisoners. So it can be interpreted as a mere reaction to the unexpected media hype around the Chibok kidnapping. The video did touch on some of what Boko Haram intended the kidnapping to symbolize, their political goals, rather than a chance for negotiating or ransom. The intended message of the kidnapping was more of a display of Boko Haram's political goals. They have more collateral to bargain with the Nigerian government for the release of Boko Haram members in prison and to show not only Nigeria, but suddenly the entire world, how powerful they are and how the Nigerian state is not able to stop them. Although Boko Haram has succeeded in demonstrating their power and their ruthlessness across the world, the kidnapping did more than that. It took a while for the hashtag campaign to gain momentum and raise international awareness, but it did eventually. Before the media explosion happened around the Chibok kidnapping, Boko Haram's kidnappings were largely an unreported issue outside of Nigeria. As the senders of the message, Boko Haram might not have anticipated the media hype around the Chibok kidnapping. In terms of publicity, the kidnapping did more for Boko Haram than they could possibly imagine. Not only did the world suddenly take note of the group, they were allegedly also praised by Somalia's Al-Shabaab for their fight against those who targeted Islam. Whether Boko Haram's intended message with the kidnapping in Chibok was received cannot be debated. The Nigerian government suddenly faced a massive amount of pressure to prove the terrorist group wrong. What the message has also done, and this was something that Boko Haram definitely did not anticipate, was to create an international community that was focused on northern Nigeria, women in Nigeria, and women in Africa at large. Suddenly, the world is more aware of issues like poverty, discrimination, and the helplessness that citizens of northern Nigeria face. More research is done on these issues, although kidnapping and terrorist attacks continue on African soil, and particularly in Nigeria, the international community is more aware of these issues that Africans face, and unconventional ways of pressuring governments into action could more readily be deployed by those not sitting in administrative offices. The next case study was that of Al-Shabaab. Al-Shabaab, as a violent extremist group, has had a massive evolution in terms of their discourses, their usage of messaging and communications. In Al-Shabaab's early years, they presented themselves as the only viable governing alternative left in Somalia. The initial messaging was very nationalistic, and they described themselves as the only remaining defenders of Somalia against foreign incursion. When the group started operating independently from the Islamic Courts Union, the ICU, the successes of their guerrilla campaign against the Ethiopian military in Somalia garnered significant support for the group. They succeeded especially in the south central part of Somalia, including the important city of Kismayo. And to suit this image of an alternative governing force, the group started to develop strategic media structures that would appeal to the wider Somali audience, locally and regionally. At the start of their campaign, Al-Shabaab produced a few propaganda films as a tool for recruiting both local and international jihadis. These films were circulated in many forms and can actually still be found on various sites like Al-Kataib and jihadology.net. The media and messaging published in the Somali language were aligned with Al-Shabaab's plan for Somalia to establish the caliphate and get rid of the infidels. Al-Shabaab made use of Somali media mainly aimed at two specific audiences: the Somali locals living in Somalia and other Somalis living locally, regionally. When aiming the message at local Somalis, a very specific discourse is used. Seminars on Islamic jurisprudence were held, along with meetings about sport and the distribution of grain and livestock, very local messages. These acts are seen as a form of discourse, framing the groups as the saviors and the leaders of the Somali society. In 2007, AMISOM troops entered Mogadishu. This prompted Al-Shabaab to shift the target of its strategic communications from the Somali government members, the invading Ethiopians and the international supporters, to troop contributing countries of AMISOM. These troops were labeled and framed as the Christian invaders, crusaders, and non-believers. Al-Shabaab created these specific frames and shaped the discourses of the troops to establish themselves as the saviors of Somalia. Discourses used by the groups presented the situation in such a way that the war in Somalia appeared to be part of a wider global clash of civilizations. Although these communications and discourse usage were initially intended to garner local support, placing Somalia in the context of a wider global issue immediately broadens their audience to a more international target. The issue of framing is highlighted here in the application of CDA. Al-Shabaab successfully constructed a reality in which they are the good guys. This form of framing is one employed by insurgencies and mainstream media alike, emphasizing certain events and facts and seriously downplaying others. This form of framing and shaping discourse then creates a type of filter that would include or exclude certain information. For Al-Shabaab to successfully frame themselves as the good guys, the contextual realities of Somalia and surrounding region played into their discourses. Towards the end of 2007, Al-Shabaab began seriously utilizing the internet. One needs to bear in mind that in the early stages of Al-Shabaab's internet usage, they were still relatively small and did not control any traditional media outlets because they did not control any territory yet. They used websites, small websites like Hegan.net or Kataib.net in the early years of their formation and development. On these sites, they have since been discontinued. Somali speakers were mostly the target audience. So all of the text, audio, and videos posted were posted in Somali language. Now, structurally, this had to be a problem since internet access is obviously very limited in Somalia. However, it's widely used by exiles in the Somali diaspora, in the Gulf, and in the West. As Al-Shabaab international presence grew from 2006 to 2007, they increasingly introduced more Arabic subtitles and Arabic audio. As the growing ties between Al-Shabaab and Al-Qaeda emerged, Al-Shabaab increasingly made use of suicide attacks as well. At first, these attacks remained within the localized focus of the groups and were aimed at the transitional federal government, the TFG officials, and their infrastructure within Somalia. But they later became increasingly internationalized. Before Al-Shabaab ties with Al-Qaeda, the concept of suicide attacks had been a foreign idea in Somalia. Another example of the Al-Qaeda influence on their discourses is that these attacks were largely carried out by foreign recruits. The use of foreign recruits, once again, indicates Al-Shabaab's ability to start to reach a foreign audience. There's no doubt that the Al-Qaeda influence in marketing played a clear role in franchising Al-Shabaab as an international organization. Al-Shabaab's first attacks off Somali soil happened in 2010 when suicide bombers set off 2 blasts in Kampala, Uganda, where crowds were watching the FIFA World Cup. Spokesperson for Al-Shabaab claimed the attack on Al-Shabaab's behalf. This attack as a discourse could be aimed to please the local Somali audience, as their target was the troops invading Somalia, as well as the more international audience, to prove that the group is capable of more international attacks. When the Westgate Mall was attacked in Kenya in September of 2013, a number of noteworthy discourse events took place. Firstly, the message of the attack itself. And secondly, Al-Shabaab's unique usage of social media, specifically Twitter, during the attack. Al-Shabaab claimed that the attack was retributive justice for crimes committed. These crimes referred to here would be the integration of the Kenyan Defense Forces, the KDF, into AMISOM. Kenya would then adopt AMISOM's mandate, and by extension, the West's mandate. So Kenya became the West. And in terms of African countries, Kenya provided 26% of AMISOM forces at the time, with only Burundi contributing more. A study done in 2012 by Portland Communications indicated that Kenya was the second most active African country on Twitter, with only South Africa being more active on this particular site. ICT infrastructure in Kenya provides affordable and easy access to mobile phones and the internet. Although Kenya has employed some very questionable forms of censorship in the past, the strictest forms of media control were only proposed by the Kenyan parliament after the Westgate attack. Memorandum by parliament dictated terms of freedom of expression for journalists, banning them from publishing or broadcasting any material that might undermine security operations. Many of these would be justified by what happened or did not happen at the Westgate Mall attack. However, there is more open access information in Kenya than in Somalia, something that Al-Shabaab could rely on throughout their rise to regional presence. At the time of the attack, Al-Shabaab was using the Twitter handle HSM Press. Due to retweets by Al-Shabaab followers, 4.5 million tweets appeared with this handle before the account was shut down by Twitter. It was clear that Al-Shabaab was definitely comfortable enough on the social network that an account being shut down would not stop them from keeping the audiences captive. Between September 21 and 24, at least 8 different Al-Shabaab affiliated Twitter accounts were active and tweeted more than 500 times. And this included a quip directly at Twitter, where Al-Shabaab tweeted, they have suffered another casualty, Twitter account loss. They were being funny on Twitter. David Mayer was one of the scholars who analyzed thousands of tweets used during the attack. He identified 6 audiences at which various tweets were aimed: the general Kenyan population, the Kenyan government, the West, the media, terrorist sympathizers, and emergency responders. Although the analysis of these tweets would fall into the more traditional form of discourse analysis, the analysis of words and text, a correlation can be drawn between the audiences at which the texts discourses were aimed and at which the attack as a discourse was aimed. During the attack, Al-Shabaab members responsible for the attack told Muslims inside the shopping center to leave and expressed that non-Muslims would be targeted. Some civilians in the shopping center were asked to name the mother of the Muhammad or to recite the Shahada. Al-Shabaab later called this a meticulous vetting process to separate the Muslims from the kuffar. This vetting process is not a new tactic for jihadist groups. It aligns with the idea of global jihad. What makes this particularly interesting is this is a very international tactic. And if we look at this at a discourse, it kind of creates a bit of a paradox. Since most of Al-Shabaab's actions, discourses, is very regionalized and very localized. So another paradox here arises upon considering the Al-Shabaab leader at the time, Ahmed Godane. He was known to have killed even Muslims if they did not live according to a strict enough form of Sharia. To add to the blurring of Al-Shabaab's discourses in this regard, they continuously proclaimed that Kenya was the target, that the attack was a geographical one, a just retribution, as it were, for the Kenyan troops present in Somalia. The whole angle of establishing the Islamic Caliphate and the global jihad seem to have been relatively downplayed. Although Al-Shabaab made significant use of Twitter during the attack, they were by no means alone in utilizing the platform. The Kenyan authorities, civilians, eyewitnesses, and even terrorist sympathizers also used Twitter to spread information about the attack. This created a minefield of text and hashtags, making the spreading of misinformation and the relay of sensitive information a serious problem. Some users even complained that there were too many hashtags linked to the attack. Different from the very organized Bring Back Our Girls campaign in Nigeria, the Westgate siege saw as many as 5 different hashtags used interchangeably by both the public and the media. Now, this is understandable when considering that the Westgate attack was live tweeted and the Shabaab kidnapping only gained media traction after the physical attack. Government officials tried to provide updates of the situation through Twitter, urging the public to stay away from Westgate and urging users to be responsible when sharing information. The Kenyan Defense Force also used this platform, similarly to Al-Shabaab, to frame themselves in a certain way. This followed massive public criticism of how the government and first responders were handling the situation. The Kenyan military used phrases like dominated, complete control, and fully in charge, providing different frames in text form on what could have been seen on the ground. The most embarrassing issue for the KDF was possibly sending armored vehicles and large amounts of ammunition and soldiers to the Westgate shopping center, but at the same time, they claimed there were only 5 to 10 terrorists within the mall. So as a theoretical anchor of the study, it dictates that to critically analyze the discourse, a variety of factors need to be considered. Al-Shabaab and Somalia's history and the complexity thereof makes it clear that this phenomenon of insurgency in Africa cannot be analyzed as a homogeneous problem across the continent. Historically, Somalia was passed around from one colonial or Western power or owner to another, creating a society riddled with discontents. Since the 1800s, clans already aimed to revolt against these external powers, with the first organization to facilitate this revolt, the Dervish state, forming and operating for many years. This can be described as the root of Somalia's age-old resistance to external power and influence, or the root of Somalia's culture of insurgency. 200 years later, Ethiopia, supported by the US, invaded Somalia, splintered their local government structure, the International Courts Union, or the Islamic Courts Union, and reignited the hostility towards Western powers and even neighboring countries supported by these Western powers. With many aims at governance and ideology having failed in Somalia, the vacuum of governance was filled with one of the only viable options left, which was religion. The culmination of events leading to the creation of Al-Shabaab also served as the first motivation for messaging by the group. Discourses and messages were used not only to relay information, but also to create a certain frame. Effectively, Al-Shabaab has had a relationship with the media and with effectively using discourse since their birth. It started with framing themselves as the saviors of a ravaged and divided country. This framing and manner of messaging evolved as new and improved technology became available. It has been clear since Al-Shabaab's early years that they realized the importance of using arising opportunities. As messaging evolved, framing evolved to reach a regional audience and later an international audience, each time when the opportunity presented itself. Discourses were not messages sent into a void, hoping that the correct audience would be reached. Al-Shabaab has proven time and time again that it should be regarded as a living organism, changing and evolving to adapt to the society or the situation in which it finds itself. Messaging, target audiences, and general discourses have evolved and changed as the group did, contributing to Al-Shabaab being a complex and even vibrant case study in this type of research. To conclude, the discourses surrounding and used by terrorist groups in Africa demands continuous study, continuous analysis, and critique. The field of terrorism and counterterrorism study is ever evolving. And to this, the ever-growing world, ever-shrinking world, and a fast-paced and adaptable interdisciplinary field of research emerges. Alternative action needs to start with researchers like us asking questions that have not been asked before and exploring various avenues of theory and research that have not been combined before and making suggestions that have not been made before. I hope that I am on the path to do that, and I hope you have enjoyed me sharing my research with you. I'm looking forward to some discussion. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Well, I certainly found that absolutely fascinating. So I'm going to open the floor to questions. Before we start, Alta, would just let me know, would you prefer to hear one question and respond to it, or would you prefer to take a batch of 3 and respond to those?
I think we can have a conversation. I would be happy to hear a question and respond to it. That's fine.
All right, thanks. In that case, I'm going to open the floor now. So does anyone have a question to kick off the Q&A with? We'll give people a few seconds to get their thoughts in order. Okay, right now, it doesn't seem like there are any takers at the moment. I hope it's because people are just, figuring out how to articulate their questions. And in that case, I'm going to award the privilege of asking the first question to myself. So because I've got a few. I want to kick off with one of the dynamics that you highlighted in your research is the way in which the discourses used by Al-Shabaab exhibit a kind of push-pull between aligning themselves with the global jihad on the one hand, but at the same time, at other instances, they veer towards framing themselves as responding to very specific local concerns. So there's a kind of push-pull dynamic going on there. What I'm curious about is this. Have you been able to discern the particular sets of conditions under which the discourse sort of veers towards one end or the other? Put differently, have you been able to figure out more or less what prompts Al-Shabaab to construct themselves as actors in the global jihad versus protectors of local concerns?
Good question. All right. So basically, if I look at your question, it is when I study Al-Shabaab, I can clearly see that there's a shift between them. When are we local? When are we international? And one of the things that I found very prominent in what you call the conditions for this type of shift was internal and external pressures. And this was actually quite interesting in my research, because one of the big internal pressures for Al-Shabaab in kind of dictating when they would act according to local pressures and when they would act according to international pressures was leadership. So, for example, I spoke about Godani, but they have a long line of leadership, and not only leadership, but also prominent individuals within these structures. And these prominent individuals and the discourses that they use, and sometimes I almost want to say an individual themselves as a discourse, can influence whether the group acts as veering towards international jihad or veering towards serving local interests. They had one of their members, they gave him a new name. I can't off the top of my head remember his traditional name now, but they added to his name Al-Amriki, basically stating that he was from America. And this was a very beautiful playing card for them to state, but we are so international that we even recruited an American into our ranks. So look at our Am I back? That individual would write sermons, circulate sermons under this Al-Amriki name, and that would play a lot into Al-Shabaab's international presence and give them some sort of international credence to state, but look at the type of members that we have. So that was very interesting to find. Also, what also gave them a shift in whether they are playing towards a more localized audience or towards a more internationalized audience would be affiliation at the time. We also saw this when they just broke away from the Islamic Courts Union. They were very focused on local Somali interests and as I also said, establishing themselves as the only viable governing force left in Somalia. And then as soon as Al-Qaeda started to take a lot more notice of them, we saw a very tangible influence of Al-Qaeda discourses, bringing in of Al-Qaeda tactics. They started to praise Al-Qaeda leaders in their own propaganda videos. So that started to play towards a more internationalized presence and internationalized discourses that they were sending. So the conditions kind of playing towards, are we going to move internationalized? Are we going to move regionalized? There's a combination of internal and external pressures dictating these types of pressures.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think your response illustrates the sort of the very finely textured analysis that you do. All right, so it seems like we have a question we have one question in the text box, so maybe I'm just going to give you an opportunity to respond to that one. And then we have a question from Dr. Nyambe. So I'll first read the one to you in the text, in the chat session from Dominic Bukela, who refers to the Greater Somalia, the straddle Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Djibouti. And the question is, was there a special discourse or framing targeted to this regional audience across the Greater Somalia, in addition to national and international audiences?
Hi, Dominique. Thank you for your question. I think specific discourses is something, it's kind of, that's a difficult thing to do. I think what happened with one of the clear things that can be identified with Al-Shabaab's discourses and with their framing was in many cases language usage. And one of the first ways to kind of catch what the intended audience would be language usage. And they made a stark, it was a bit more subtle, where they started to add Arabic subtitles to the already existing propaganda videos, and then later on they started to use more Arabic language in their videos, which indicated a more shift towards an international audience. But if you're talking about, as you say, the greater Somalia, Kenya, Ethiopia, I think one of the indicators there that the discourses were aimed at that audiences was the content of their messaging at a specific stage in time as well. Because we know that if we looked at the development of Al-Shabaab and the development of that region at the time, there was no credence given to the borders at the time. So that regional audience wouldn't have a discourse specifically aimed at them. I think what Al-Shabaab would do was kind of deliver a catch-all for the region and then move towards the more internationalized audience. As I mentioned, the biggest giveaway for me in the research was language usage and the content. The content of the messaging as well, when it was regionalized and localized, the content of the messages would refer to local taxes, how to pay your taxes, to whom to pay your taxes, how to move your cattle, etc. There would be some sermons in there, etc., to keep the religious undertone going. But the moment that the messaging started to become more internationalized, there would be a lot more global jihad flavor in there than simply talking about cows and taxes.
Thanks. Oliver, please ask your question.
Oh, yes, thanks, Thinas, and thanks, Alta, for this interesting presentation. I am curious to know perhaps what I may call the trends in the discourse shown by these terrorist organizations. With Al-Shabaab, would you say they are inventing something new in the ways in which they are framing their cause? For example, are they inventing the wheel? Are there any continuities that you find in the discourse on terrorism in Africa?
Thank you so much, Oliver. This is a very good question for me because it kind of gives me justification for my current research. I find a lot of continuity across the discourses by terrorist groups in Africa, and there is the actual current debate going on, and one of the current debates that I'm studying is if, for example, cyber terrorism is even a thing in Africa. Because what I found, and I mentioned this in the Al-Shabaab case study as well, that Al-Shabaab is always ready to pounce on the next best opportunity to disseminate discourse or to disseminate a message. When they started disseminating, they were using shortwave radios, they were using good old pamphlets, and they were using good old word of mouth. And then later on, they started using magazines. They started slowly using the internet. Then they started using social media. So I won't say they are reinventing the wheel, rather than they are utilizing the wheel. Then they are using a bicycle, then they are using a motorcycle, and now we are starting to drive a Toyota Corolla, and maybe we're moving towards a Porsche, maybe. So I don't think they're reinventing the wheel, rather than I think terrorists will always use the best possible opportunities at hand and the best possible resources that they have at hand. If those best possible resources are word of mouth, then they will use it. If the best possible resources are cyber hacking systems, then they will use it. So I don't think they are reinventing the wheel or they are being super innovative. I think they are simply sticking with international trends, to be quite honest. Thank you so much for your question.
Fantastic. Do we have any further questions? seems like someone is typing a question in the text box in the chat, and I'll read that soon. Oh, hold on. There's a hand. Okay, Nkla, please ask your question.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Alta, for your presentation. Thought-provoking. I'm going to, I don't know whether it's going to be a question or it's a comment or it's me thinking out loud. I'm going to enter into your conversation using a different kind of a mode of thinking that you perhaps are not familiar with. I'm thinking with Nuruddin Farah at the back of my head, and also thinking about the idea of creating African realities where Africans are able to choose what they want to believe. How possible is that, given a context where I'm looking at the Somali context, where no sort of organized government works, only, clannish kinds of warlords and also international warlords actually make sense, are the ones that create reality within, especially the Somalian context.
Oh, you're leaving the tough ones. That's a very tough comment and a very tough, question, if we can call it that. I think at the moment, and I think this is why groups like Al-Shabaab, and I want to broaden this up to say groups like Al-Shabaab, because you mentioned warlords and clan activities is very active in Somalia and the Somali region as well, because we know that structured government systems are not very effective in that region. And I think that the civil societies up there, if we look at what they are used to, and that is so little, that the governance vacuum and the leadership vacuums that exist there makes it quite a fertile breeding ground for things like warlordism and terrorism to be quite rife, because the leadership vacuum that exists. If citizens that are so exposed to poverty and things like that, if they are presented with the slightest opportunity of leadership, I think then if a slightly workable governing force can be found, then that will be viable. And I think that is what happened with Al-Shabaab as well. When they broke away from the Islamic Courts Union and they took on the transitional federal government because they weren't working, then they provided schools, they provided roads, they provided a taxation system, they provided many, many things that the Somali government could not do. And that's why they garnered so much local support, because they could go to the citizens and say, never mind all of the terrorist activities that we are doing, look at the good things that we are providing to you guys as citizens. And that is what garnered a lot of support for them from the local civil societies as well.
All right, another question from Dominic. Please go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you again for having me. And I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but Dr. Alta, when you're talking about the Westgate attack, and I agree with you that the way the communication was managed was not very good. It was chaotic. The head of the police could say this, the head of military could say this, the cabinet minister could say this, and all those was the confusion. And actually it played into the hands of the attackers, who are Al-Shabaab. But come to the 14 Riverside Drive, or the Dusit B2 attack that happened again in Nairobi in 2019, there's a consensus that the communication that time was much better. It was streamlined. It was only one person from the government who was always briefing the country, briefing the media, and that way somehow they were able to manage the situation. So I don't know, one, if you agree that yes, the 14 Riverside Drive communication was managed well, and when you manage communication, you can actually help in addressing some of these hostage situations. But I was also eager to know, like for the case of the Boko Haram, I don't know how the Nigerian government or the regional government have been able to handle communication whenever they have issues with Boko Haram. Thank you.
Thank you, Dominique. And it's I think it's a very difficult thing for African governments to handle communication and to find that you know, that perfect middle ground between government sanctioned communication and freedom of speech. And there's a lot of difficulties in drafting legislation. And I know the Nigerian government is having a massive issue with that at the moment as well, on what do we label as, you know, when is this a terrorist sending a tweet, or when is it just a disgruntled youth sending a tweet? And there's a lot that I think Africa can learn there from the international community as well, on how to find that middle ground between not completely silencing your civil society, because as we can also see, the moment that we only have government sanctioned communications in terms of and the aftermath of the attack, then massive questions can arise also in terms of, do we believe what they say? Because we know that a certain frame wants to be sent out. We know that a certain discourse wants to be sent out. The government do not want to be embarrassed again, like we saw after the Westgate attack. So I think for African governments, there's still a lot to learn there. And I think with research like the research like we are doing, I think we can possibly assist in that. I hope we can assist in that. I think for governments to learn from academics, they also have to be open to some critique, which is always difficult for a government to accept.
I'm going to hop in right there and just allow myself to ask another question on the back of that question about the Westgate Mall attack. What I find fascinating about one of the potential differences between the Bring Back Our Girls initiative and the Boko Haram kidnappings versus the mall attack is that in the aftermath of the kidnapping of the girls, we saw at one point an international outpouring of grief, and the campaign garnered a degree of international traction, even from the United States. Members of the Republican Party, the GOP, conservatives, participated in this campaign, sort of requesting that the girls be returned and so forth, which is fine and everything. But it's, from one perspective, that's fascinating. That it almost seems like what some people have called a kind of misery tourism, or a kind of vicarious activism, that they react to the mediatized plight of this racialized other without attending to the racialized problems in America. So, but I'm curious as to whether the Westgate Mall attacks garnered anything like a similar international outpouring of grief. My assumption is no. So that, if you can speak to that, my point is that seems kind of interesting, that one set of victims elicits global sympathy, but others don't. I don't know if that's something that your research has turned up, and whether it's something you'd like to speak to.
It's not something I didn't do a comparative study of the two attacks, which would be a good idea to do, I think. But what I did come across, and what I did use in my study that I didn't speak to today, was news values, where I looked at what made something more newsworthy. Why would people sit up and look at the small fishing village in Africa and not necessarily at the mall in Westgate? And I think the novelty of the fishing village in Africa, the novelty of Chibok, the fact that Michelle Obama was sitting all sad looking with the little paper saying, "Bring back our girls," the novelty of it all drew more attention to the Westgate Mall attack. At the same time, if we look at the Westgate Mall attack, something like a school shooting that we see all the time in America, it's not that novel to see something like that happen. So I think the Westgate Mall attack kind of lost out a bit in terms of novelty there. and there wasn't as much celebrity buy-in.
Thanks. That's a comprehensive answer. Let's see, do we have any other questions? I'm going to allow myself to ask one more question because I have many. I'm keeping back. I'll ask one more question, and then after that, if anybody else would like to ask a question after mine, please raise your hand, or if you're shy, then go ahead and type your question in the chat box, and I'll be happy to read it. Otherwise, we'll thank Alta after mine. So my question begins with a comment on the way that you structured the entire presentation. I imagine that it might have been, at least at many institutions, it might have been easy to try and frame this entire discussion from a Western perspective on terrorism, to try and sort of question what are some of the Western discourses, i.e. predominantly American discourses on terrorism in Africa. And that's not what you did. I appreciate the innovation that you brought to the way that you structured the research and the presentation. It seems very clear to me that everything is sort of geared, everything pivots on the question, what are the discourses that Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab use to construct themselves, to frame themselves, to spread propaganda? It's sort of, it's an approach that centers the discourses they generate, and when you analyze the discourses generated about them, you tend to focus on those generated within the countries directly affected. So it's you resist the temptation to fall into an exclusively Western perspective, which I appreciate. I think it's innovative and it's wonderful. Now, given that the critical discourse analysis is driven by the desire to question and critique power, it seems to me that implicitly you critique a lazy Western narrative. Without explicitly saying it, it seems to me like one of the takeaways from your presentation is that Western critiques of terrorism in Africa as something perpetrated by savages in a benighted part of the world are horrendously simplistic, apart from being racist. So my question is, would you categorize your research as contributing to an archive of scholarly work that counters hegemonic Western perspectives? Is that a central concern for you, or are you happy to leave that as something that is implicit in the research, given that you want to focus on other objectives?
I think I think you called me out on not falling into the trap of using overly using Western discourses on terrorism. I do think Western discourses on terrorism is quite valuable. That's why I also mentioned the name making of 9/11, because that was a pivotal event in terms of terrorism research and definitions and things that we still use in terrorism studies across the world today, that kind of springboarded off a single event. So there is, in some sense, no getting away from that. But in the same vein, I always pride myself in being an African and trying to look at African problems, with a largely African lens. And I think that is quite important, and that is why I love using critical discourse analysis so much, because it lends itself towards these different applications of a theory, regardless of the geographical context of it, even though we can say, like, the theory was conceptualized and born in a Western frame as well. So I think at the same time, while realizing the value of contributions made from the West in terms of terrorism study, in terms of discourse analysis, I think one should be very, very careful and very aware of what you are studying. And within my research, I always try to do, and I think if you gave me 3 hours to talk, I probably would have provided a more of a conceptual discourse analysis on the creation of Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab and how the evolution from the inception of these groups on African soil and how their colonial pasts also contributed to them acting and behaving in the ways that they do today. So I think it's something that it cannot be escaped from in my research, and I hope that would be what puts the research apart.
Thank you very much. So do we have a final question for Alta? Okay, it seems like that's not the case. So as a closing comment from me, I mean, as you know, critical discourse analysis is fundamentally interdisciplinary. And this kind of interdisciplinary work and transdisciplinary work is increasingly vital. So on those grounds, I'd like to thank you very much for speaking to us. I've enjoyed it tremendously attending presentations hosted in your department, and I'm grateful that you were willing to speak to us because I feel like the kinds of work that we do lend themselves to this kind of interdisciplinary work so that we can share ideas across departments, even across departments that might not in any traditional sense be seen as having much in common. Clearly, there is a great deal that we can talk about. So my sincere gratitude to you for an excellent presentation that I enjoyed tremendously, and my gratitude also to the audience for your active participation. And as always, to Hunter Henning for putting together the departmental seminar, for doing all of the legwork. Thank you for the expertise and the passion that you bring to bear here. To the rest of the audience, thank you all very much and have a fantastic day. Thanks again, Alta.
Thank you, Tinus. Keep well.